Yes, welcome to a short introduction of the Neoan3-apps Db wrapper that we are going to explore now outside of the Neoan3 framework for a general use case. And of course, this is true for being used in Neoan3 as well as if you are just going to use the DB class for your own projects, so without using a framework or using a different framework. It kind of depends. So the question is, of course, why? Well, this pretty simply answered is like we want to have a way of writing secure queries to the database, which means we want to use prepared statements for security and performance reasons. And the question is how we can do that in a less verbose way than the PHP extensions, so MySQLi or PDO would provide us with, because that is not a convenient way of actually talking to the database. That means we want to keep the application flow in mind. So I assume that whatever you're working with, you will handle user input, you will handle your variables in PHP, and you want to have a convenient and functional way of, like handling those variables to your queries, and then, produce the right kind of outcome depending on your needs. Why we want to do that is, of course, to ensure rapid development. We don't want to write any kind of verbose language. We want to use just the logical syntax to go forward and basically get done what we actually want to get done, so solve problems. Rather than building solutions, we want to build applications. And last but not least, that's an important point, we want to use an interface that is fast. So we don't want to have anything that would slow down the progress. Any kind of database connection, of course, will be a hit on your performance. So we want to make sure that the way those connections are handled and how we're going to ask the database is relatively or as fast as possible with the most convenience that we can provide. So how does the installation go? So just a couple of requirements here first. So this does work in PHP 5.6 and above. Of course, nowadays I'd recommend 7.3, and you will see that a lot of the language no, let's make this short. It does not make sense to start a new project with PHP 5.6. So if you have the chance to set up a project, be sure it's at least a 7.2, and I would recommend 7.3 at the moment to use as your basic setup of a new project. You don't really need Composer, but I highly recommend it. Everything we're going to look at today will be using the assumption that you use Composer for third-party libraries and apps you're using. Neoan3, the DB app of Neoan3 uses Composer as well to install itself, and that's how you can handle things easily. And of course, you need some kind of database. So this works with basically everything that the MySQLi extension from PHP would handle. So it's a little bit more, but the most common things that we're going to talk about are MySQL and MariaDB. And assuming that you have a classical setup, so MySQL on your server of some sort. And MariaDB is a little bit lighter and ships with a couple of things. Like I personally use XAMPP for Windows, for example, so that would use MariaDB, which is just a SQL flavor that is basically just a little lighter than MySQL. Okay, so the installation itself is, of course, again, recommended you Composer. So you do Composer require Neoan3-apps/db. And I assume that is in whatever context you're working with already the case if you work with Composer, but just for to be complete here, you would have to require the autoload from Composer in your project once. All right, that said, What about like the database structure itself? So there are a couple of assumptions that you should follow in order to get the most out of it. So this is a list now that is not necessarily a must. It just helps you to get a lot of the functionality that would automate things for you easier. So we assume the tables are a snake case and the columns as well. We assume that the foreign keys include the foreign model name. So let's just say you have a blog post and you have an author ID, and that author ID represents a user ID in your user table. In that case, please call that author user ID, so the system can automatically make the assumptions that this author ID is not just any ID, but it's actually a user ID. So that there's a table user which carries an ID. Primary key is named ID, and this is that's always true. So you need to name your primary key ID. So again, talking about the user ID in the user table itself, that would simply be ID, and this ID can be either binary if you're planning to use universal unique IDs, or it could be an auto-incremented integer in case you're going for that option. I will not get so much into the pros and cons of those two systems. Personally, I think if you have a bigger project, and if you also want to have if you work with URLs, for example, that if you want to have basically IDs to be unguessable, to make it short, you would want to have UUIDs. Otherwise, there is a lot of convenience in auto increment IDs when it comes to generating IDs and actually finding something per eye in a database. Now, the last assumption basically results of the first one. So there is the capability to soft delete something. Soft deletes columns will be named delete date, and so that it will be a nullable field, nullable column that is either a date or a date time, and you want to have that in case you want to delete something that is either revertible, that you want to track for historical purposes, for compliance reasons, you name it. For uniqueness tests, I mean, there are countless reasons why you would want basically a row to be deleted but not lose the information that was once contained in that row. So instead of a hard delete, you want to set a delete stamp basically, and in that case we would need it to have a delete date. So that's delete_date. Okay, so let's look at the basic operations. I think that's pretty clear. So what you are going to do on a day-to-day basis when you work with databases from your application will be either a select, an insert, an update, or a delete. So this is basically what we want to look into a little bit deeper. So let me close this for now and jump over into code. And let's just look at a couple of things here. So what you see on your right is the database that I have set up. So I have a database that's called DB app with two tables. One is called user and one is called user email. So we have actually two users at the moment. As you can see, I'm using unique IDs. Those are binary values. So tester2 and tester are my two users. And I have a user email that refers to one of the users. I think that's tester2, but we'll find out about that soon. Okay, so let's jump into it. So the first thing we want to do is basically like get introduced to okay, what's the setup? So as I told you already, so eventually in your program you want to have the auto load basically required. And this normally happens, like if you have a framework, this is probably taken care of already. If you're starting from scratch, you want to have that in your index or whatever you initialize the application. Then I'm going to use the DB and the DB exception as well. That's the DB exception is something that I'm not sure if we have time to go into, but basically handles errors depending on what we wanna try and catch. You need to have a path defined. Now, for those of you who are using a Neoan3, don't worry about that. That path will be defined already, and everything is taken care of. Depending if you use something else. So you're, for example, like in this context, just outside of anywhere. So we're right now in the index on the root, and you want to define that as a root. You don't have any kind of external pathing whatsoever. Please define it yourself. Again, in most cases, you will not have to. So path is basically something that is used as a root to where your application runs. So in many cases, this variable might be set, but might be called differently depending on the the framework you're using. Okay, then I set a couple of environment variables. This is has a lot to do with my connection, because everything happens basically under the hood. So just to let you know, the classical way to treat that, and this is something I recommend for Neoan3 users, and depending on your framework for others as well, you can basically set those with defines, and then they just work system-wide. So something like DB name. So in that case, I again created DB app. This is the same as setting the environment on the fly. So I can just do that, and if this is set as a define, it will simply grab that up. There are a couple of variables you need. You can find them in the declaration, but we also have a list up here in the class itself. So DB host, it defaults to localhost. DB user, it defaults to root. DB name, we will have to set in our case, and DB password, it defaults to not set. And then there are optional values. Assumes UUID, so that's if you want to use the unique ID handling on an automated basis. And the dbdef errors is something you want to set if you're developing the application and you want to have error handling that is a little bit more verbose than just throwing an error that says that query wasn't possible. DB file location is something we're going to go in a little bit later. Right now, the only thing we need to set are the connection variables. So I say, okay, which name? Again, I'm using XAMPP for Windows, so root is the user for me, and no password is the password for me on this local host. So this is all I need to define is, well, which database name am I connecting to? Assumes UUID. In this demo, I will basically also, like I show you this is a binary value. It is not an auto incremented value. So I'm going to use this as an example. And def errors, for our purposes, I think that makes sense. We are basically running in developing mode at the moment. So here's a class that I will go into later, but here the first point of what I want to make is I'm going to run the function select. As you can see, it's pretty primitive, so I'm going to run this class, initiate the class as output, as test, and then I run the function select and var dump the whole thing. So pretty simple. We're effectively just going to run this one. All right. So let's first look at the first example, and that's the select. So the quick start and the easy way to basically use the DB ask is to start with a greater than, and then say, all right, this enables me to basically write SQL, and that is basically, if I were to run this, I would see it returns an array of associative arrays. So what does that mean? It means that it always returns a regular array that contains the results. Right? So in this case, I only expect one result, so it would be in that case output 0, that would give me now. And if I basically wanted to go to that, I can basically do that and say, all right, and let's actually name this differently. Now, no, I can't do that. It is here as now. All right. And then I see it only contains the string. So that's basically the easy start. So it does everything for me. It initializes the connection. It prepares this whole thing and executes it, and basically fetches an ASOC that I can then basically output as results directly. So that's pretty convenient. However, this is probably normally not how we want to write something. So let's basically try out now what we have in the user database, so you can see what happens if let's do it like this. So select everything from user. So I should get 2 rows now, and I do. So the first array would be tester2, and then the second one would be tester, and they have unique IDs and different insert dates. These are today's dates, and both of them are not deleted, as you can see. So that's fine, but that's not really convenient, and that's not really the way we want to write something. So let's just assume that most queries are either very simple or relatively complex. So in this first example, let's use the DBeasy. DBeasy uses a markup that is simplified by a lot. So for example, in this case, I would simply write user.everything, and the result of it would be exactly the same. So I would basically get now every column out of the user table. And as you can see, it has exactly the result as before. So I simplify the query by an enormous amount. So of course this happens in the same way if I ask for a particular entity, particular column, and I say, okay, I only get the IDs now, right? So it makes it very easy. So what else can I do? So the second parameter is a condition. So let's just say, in this case, I want to say, okay, where delete date is empty, right? So is null. So in that case, I only want to have undeleted users, and this will not make a difference because I don't have deleted users. But you can see that this understands it now as a condition. And this is actually a good point to say, like, okay, let's look into what's actually happening under the hood. So if I run db-debug, I will always get the generated SQL string and the exclusion if it's a prepared statement, in which case it is not. I don't do anything with this, where I'm not really giving it values. So select user ID as ID from user where delete date is null. This is what's happening here. And you will see that in case I want to declare this a little bit easier, I can do things like this and say, well, without delete date. And what happens here is the query itself is the same, right? And if I actually execute the query, then I will see I still get the 2 results. So this is a way shorter form. Let's just compare this for a moment and say, okay, so the alternative would be to say select ID from user where delete date is null. Right? So as you can see, this is way easier, faster, and very readable to write. However, what I can do in the DB ask, but actually let's talk about the third parameter first. So in this case, I can have a third parameter that would basically give us additional functionality. So every function is basically a SQL function that would be named as you would expect, but we can go into that a little bit deeper. And that returns an array that always has 2 direct values. So in that case, I'm going to say 0, 1. Doesn't have to be a string. And as you can see, I get only 1 result now because I limit it. Right? So I think you get the gist of it. So now it gets really interesting though, because what about more complex queries? So let's say I want to have everything from user, but then I also have user emails. So I want to have the email that would be represented with a foreign key user ID with the appropriate user. So is it possible to simply write user email.email, which as you can see is something, and let's omit that for now and see if this runs. And as you can see, it actually works. So tester2 has an email, right? And as you can see, I only get 1 result. Why is that? Well, it seems to be the case that there's only 1 user with an email, so apparently it's a hard join. So what happens under the hood? Let's look at that again. And so what we see, what's actually happening is it says select user, user email as email from user, and then join user email on user ID equals user email user ID. So this is the assumptions we were talking about, where we basically say, okay, so apparently the foreign key in user email must be user ID. And we can see this assumption is true, and this is why this works. And I can basically write relatively complex, if I follow this table structure, I can basically already create a model here that's flattened out through to the relations that I have generated. So why did I remove the delete date? Well, for a very simple reason. As you can see, both tables have a delete date. So in the same way I would refer to the table, instead of delete date, I would have to specify. Whoops. So say, okay, in that case, I want to say where user email.delete date is null. And as you can see, oh, I'm still debugging. As you can see, I now get the result, and it's taking care of the delete date. Oops. Actually, not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. Whoops. Why not? Where user email delete date? Ah, because I did it this way. Sorry. Those are 2 options, right? So if I set this, then I cannot use the shorthand anymore. And so now it basically says, all right, here you go, and those are your results. So let's get a little bit more complex and say we're going to look for something specific. So apparently there's a tester2. Let's copy that for now and directly handle user input. So in this case, I'm going to say name is tester2. Let's just assume that comes in from an API, right? And I'm going to select, I say, from API. And here, I say from API. So what would this do now? And as you can see, if I run it, I do get an error, right? Because name is something that will simply not work. It is unsecured, so I have a problem because there is no name in this query. If I were to basically see how the query looks like, I can see that it is secure, so it will not cause an error ever. Right? It simply says like, okay, so where name equals, it's a prepared statement, and then it tries to insert the string tester2. And this does not lead to any kind of problems, other than, of course, it will not evaluate the query because there is no column name. There's a username. So I have multiple ways of basically handling it in this case. I can scream at my front-end developer for sending it over like that. But of course I can just say something like this, where I say, okay, username is from API name. This is a solution, for example, that would work. And as you can see, I now get the result out because I reformatted this code, and as we've seen, it's a prepared statement, so it is secured. But what about different forms of if we say we have more complex forms of a query? So let's just assume we're using the syntax that I already showed you, right? And say, okay, select everything from user where username equals, and now I say name, and I directly get that. So what happens now under the hood? Let's get rid of this and write a db debug. So with this double curly braces, what this is doing is basically it embraces it with the appropriate key if present from the second parameter, right? So if I run it now, you can basically see, okay, select from user where username equals question mark again, and this is then what I get send, and you can see it works just fine. If I were to execute it, I get my result out. So this is something I can do as well, and with a little bit more complex queries, this will be a little bit of an issue. So for that reason, what I want to do instead, and actually let me peek what I named this again. Name the test. Okay. Oops. So let's say test. Let's quickly open that and see how that works. Or name. Yep, that's prepared correctly. So in this case, if I run it, I get out the result again. So what happened here? Well, so there are a couple of assumptions that the db-ask makes if I start something with a slash. The first thing it means is like, okay, you want to read in a file, right? In this case, I have a SQL file that is rather primitive, but of course you would only do that if you have something a little bit more complex that you want to see nice, markup with your editor, and want to keep that nicely inlined. So right now this is in component test. So I have the opportunity to, this is just what it defaults to because this is how a Neoan3 works. But of course, you can basically say, it's called file location, and location, and you just simply set this to a value. Let's say test. So now we'll basically be in the folder test or queries. Let's do it like this. Now it will be in the folder queries of your application in the root. So basically going off of path. So let's just assume we would have a queries, and now in that case, this would mean that we expect a queries, and in the queries there will be a folder test, and in the test there will be a file test.sql. I'm not going to do that for now. I'm going to keep it as is, but I'm going to assume something else. I'm going to assume that this is not, I want to rename this file. This is actually not test, this is demo. And so I have it in the folder test and demo, and this works a little bit like the PSR namespace convention. So let's simply say, okay, in that case, let me define it a little bit closer. So it's not test, it is test demo, where it find it, and if we execute it, we can see it works still fine. So basically it reads in this and gets the name associated with it. Okay, So far so good. I think the only thing we probably want to talk about is not so much how we invoke this, but more how, let's go back basically to, let's just say user everything. What kind of options we have when it comes to selectandi and operandi. So we already introduced basically the shorthand for delete date. There's however more. Just a couple of those. It's not going to be a complete list, just you know, to let you know. So the exclamation mark would basically indicate not, and if there is nothing behind it, it would default to not, null. So in that case, we would now say like, okay, where a delete date is set, right? Because where delete date is not null is what it would translate to. So I expect if I would to run the result, there would be nothing exactly, because I don't have any deleted values in here. But that's something I could have in theory. And more interesting though, again, I don't want to go into this in detail. I want to actually do the opposite and say we're not deleted. More interesting though are the selectandi. So we can see, and let me actually run this again. We can see that we have a particular format, how the database works, for example, for the insert date, which is a timestamp. This is a format that doesn't really work that well when I operate with a client-side solution, so presumably JavaScript. So I would like to have this value in milliseconds from a Unix epoch starting. So what would I do in that case? I say, okay, so I'm going to use a hashtag and say, oh, sorry, we're still in user insert date, right? So the hashtag indicates this is a timestamp now, and I don't want to overwrite the insert date. I want to say, okay, as inserted, and if I run it, I can see that, okay, so there is an insert date. It's still in existence, and it still looks exactly the same. I'm not, you know, changing anything. But additionally to the table, I now created an inserted that would give me the timestamp in milliseconds that I can directly pass to JavaScript for, I don't know, a date picker or whatever. And that works just fine. So there are a couple of those. We call them selectandi. This is basically like how we, you know, manipulate what exactly is happening. Maybe, well, the hash operation would be one of those, and it really doesn't make sense to go into that on the deeper level as of yet, just to not, you know, get you too confused at the start. All right, then just for the sake of you know, well, being complete, let's just say that, well, of course, you know, the ask we already introduced, you can ask anything with it, but there's a format that is rarely used but possible, so I can start with a question mark as well and say, all right, please select from the table user, and in that case the second parameter would also be an array, but it would be of hits. So I could basically say, please select the ID, and in the third parameter I would have a where, but I mean, I'm going to omit that for now and say, all right, let's just run this. So, and as you can see now, I get a result of the IDs. As you probably wonder, is like, well, why use this format if I can simply use, so the if I were to use the easy, then of course I could simply say user ID, and I wouldn't need the ask for it. And you're very right with that. So this is the easier markup. However, this capability is here for a different reason. It is basically here for, and I just wanted to say that, is if you do not follow the convention, then you have the possibility to basically make this way more complicated and say, okay, so the first parameter is an array that has a table is user, and then you can start with joins, and so on. So I don't want to go into this right now. I just wanted to let you know that in theory there is the possibility to get you all the complexity that you possibly need. What I'm going to show you for the purposes of this video is basically your everyday use, how to get started quickly, and what is reasonable. Because I know that a lot of wrappers, you end up writing more than you would have to, and basically your day-to-day work will be getting particular entities out and matching them. Okay, so let's leave it at that for the select for now. And before we look at the update, let's look at an insert. What have I prepared here? Okay, this is relatively primitive. Let's start with something even easier. So let's just say, I'm going to say, all right, db ask. So I want to insert into user. And the point is, it's that simple. I say, I want to insert into user, and then I say what, right? In that case, I want to say username. And I say tester3. So as you can see, I have a username. The ID, if it is not set, the system, or actually the wrapper will create it for me. If IDs are assumed UUID, as we've said here. If it's auto increment, it will generate the ID anyway. The username is not defaults to nothing, so I'm actually going to set it. And the insert date, in my case, defaults to the current timestamp, so I also don't have to set that. The delete date defaults to null. So this is literally everything I need in order to create tester3. So in that case, let's, instead of select, let's run the insert. And of course, the insert doesn't take any parameters. And well, it didn't return anything. That's fine. So this just happened. And if we look into our user, we will see we now have a tester3 in the database. This is the easiest form to insert something. And what you see here is a little bit, whoops, I'm not sure why this happened. Is a little bit different. So in this case, I do not want to generate the ID automatically. Why? Well, apparently I'm handling it over multiple instances. So what do I do here? I say, okay, db UUID, that's a handler. And this returns the generated UUID. So this is a new UUID. I have this now outside and can work with it. And I do basically the same. Here's our example. Let's move that up. So in our case it was tester3, but here I would do tester2. And I just set the ID, and then rather than being auto-generated, it uses what I give to it. That makes perfect sense, right? And I do the same for the user email, where I say, okay, the user ID is the user ID, and the email is sum@email.com. So this is relatively easy to understand. The only tricky part about this is basically, well, what about this $? And that's rather interesting if we remember how, oh, just give me a second. Okay, so I'm back. Let's look at the where have we left off? At the insert, right? So again, as you can see, I generate the UUID externally in this case. Let's actually simply do this and say, what does this equate to? And are we still running the insert? We're not. So if I run this, then I can see, okay, this generates one of those unique IDs, and this is exactly what I want. So it is interesting to know that this itself is the handler, and it's going to maintain the UUID for quite some time. So if I, for example, were to say, okay, so I'm going to again var dump and die the user ID. So what you can see is that it is the same ID. I mean, I have a $sign prepended in this case, but it's still the same ID. So I can generate those, and they will remain the same until I decide to basically overwrite them, which I do in that case with UUID. And then you probably guessed it, new UUID. In which case that will return, and I can then simply say, okay, so from that moment on, a new UUID is assigned to the singleton. So that is quite convenient if I want to handle my IDs outside of the database, which in that case I want. Why do I want this? Well, I'm going to insert a user and a user email. They will both use the same user ID. So I don't want the user table to auto-generate an ID. I want to have this ID first on the PHP end, and I'm going to give it to it as ID, and the foreign key, the user ID on the user email, I'm going to give the same ID. And that's how I built the connection. Why the $sign? Well, the $sign is one of the operations that we're talking about when it comes to selectandi and operandi. So that would take care, depending on where I use it, if it's hexed or unhexed. So in case of, we assume UUIDs, so I never have to put that in my, so in theory, if I were to do this, right? If I say I select user ID, it would now basically hex the value of a possible binary. If I assume the UUID, then everything that's named ID or underscore ID will automatically be treated as such. And in the same way, I basically never have to select with the $sign. But if I insert, then that is not necessarily the case. So if I want to insert something, I will have to prepend the $sign in order to make a binary value out of the hexed value I have. Right, so that said, that would basically give us the tester2 and the user email accordingly. And if I look into it, then I see here's my tester2 and the user ID. So let's look at the update, and the update is rather simple. So it's still the DB ask, but as you can see in the update, the only real difference we have is a third parameter. So that's the where that we add. So we still basically say, like, please treat table user, this is what you want to set. But then instead of inserting, we say like where, in that case, username is tester2. So let's basically see in our case whether or not that is true. I want to have something a little bit more complicated. I want to say I want to update the email. Where email, and let's see what we have in our database, is sum@email.com. Is sum@email.com, and I want to change it and say, okay, I'm actually doing it exactly the opposite way. So I want to have, instead of sum.email.com, I want to have anyemail.com, where email is sum@email.com. So actually in that case, let's return this and run the update. Yeah, that's all we need. Let's actually work with the editor here and say this actually throws an exception before we go into that. And then let's execute it. And so this is maybe also interesting that we normally don't return stuff like that. Whoops, but you can see in an update case, there are a couple of things that are returned. So in this case, I can see there's no result, of course not, but we have affected rows. So with this condition, email at sum@email.com, one row was affected by this, and we don't auto increment, so we don't get an insert ID, and there was no error. I mean, I think you're familiar with the SQL error handling. So that basically gives us an indication of what happened. Still, I want to look at it and say, okay, indeed, now I have any@email.com for my tester2 user. Yes, that would be for the update. So the delete function is basically the last one, and here we basically jump into a little bit of a strange wave here. So in my example, I don't really have a user ID that I know yet, so I'm going to ask for it and say, okay, please give me simply the first ID that you have. Limit 1 is not necessary, but I'm just going to do it this way now and say, okay, let's do this and see what happens. So if I execute this, then of course I get the ID as I expected. So in that case, let's say, okay, this is the first user and I actually want to delete this user. It's kind of an awkward situation, but let's just assume. So the delete function itself is relatively simple. So I use the table that I want, in that case it's a user, and I give the appropriate ID that I want to handle. So I have the possibility to basically say, in this case, let's do this, and I say true. So this is a unnecessary parameter, or it's an optional parameter. If this is set to true, then it's a hard delete, meaning it's actually executing a delete. So again, let's return this and see what happens. And if I execute it, I actually get an error. Required field missing ID, given values ID. Oh, okay. So let's see what the issue is here. Let's quickly output that. I'm not sure what, do we have a markup error here? Different variable user. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Right. So now this should work. And so yeah, of course, you have to be careful with your variables. I think that makes sense. Typos happen. So again, we return this. So one row was affected. So let's just see. So the first user apparently is gone, which used to be our tester2, and we can see tester2 is out of the equation anymore. If I were to run this again, then what I would see if I refresh this, which apparently that's not how it works. All right. Why not? Okay. I seem to have to, how does this? Oh, no, I deleted everything. Wonderful. It doesn't sync that well. Okay. Well, let's take this out and run it. And this is not what I want to take out. Okay, I don't have any values anymore because this is not set. Okay, that makes perfect sense. We actually have to run an insert quickly because we don't have anything anymore. Okay, now let's see. Okay, and sync. All right, now our tester2 is back. All right. I think now we can see better. So we run the delete. We see one row is affected, and if I update my user, then it is gone. And that's basically how you would hard delete. And if I do the same thing again, I say like, okay, let's actually insert that again. Let's run this. So just to make sure, now we have our tester2 again, and we make a soft delete. So as you can see, I'm getting rid of the last parameter, and what I have now is, if I refresh this, I would still have it here, but the delete date is set accordingly. So it's a soft delete. So in my query, when I say where not delete date in the select, I wouldn't get any results. If I remove this one at least. So it would return an empty array. Yes, and so far for the basic introduction to this MySQL wrapper, and I hope it helps you to develop rapidly and have some fun with it.